December 1943. The English countryside lay wrapped in the brittle cold of winter, frost clinging to the grass at Hatfield Aerodrome as the first pale light broke over Hertfordshire. In a wooden hangar that smelled of fresh spruce and glue, a handful of engineers gathered around an aircraft that had already made history and was about to make it again. The prototype de Havilland Mosquito, serial number W4050, sat ready for yet another test flight, but this time something was different. Beneath its elegant wooden cowlings sat two Rolls-Royce Merlin 77 engines, high-altitude rated power plants with two-stage, two-speed superchargers that represented the absolute pinnacle of British piston engine technology. What happened that day would produce a speed record that no other Mosquito would ever match, a blistering 439 miles per hour in level flight at 29,000 feet. It was a speed so extraordinary, so utterly beyond what anyone thought possible for an operational aircraft in 1943, that it stood as both triumph and tantalizing glimpse of what might have been. Yet this remarkable achievement was born not from careful planning or enthusiastic government backing, but from stubborn determination in the face of bureaucratic rejection, material shortages, and the deeply entrenched belief that a bomber built of wood and carrying no defensive guns was nothing more than a designer's fantasy. A death sentence wrapped in plywood and fabric. The desperate problem facing Britain in the late 1930s was brutally simple. How do you build an air force capable of striking deep into enemy territory when you don't have enough metal, enough time, or enough strategic resources to compete with a rearming Nazi Germany? By 1938, Europe teetered on the brink of war, and the British Air Ministry knew with grim certainty that bombers would be essential to any coming conflict. The prevailing doctrine held that strategic bombing could cripple an enemy's war-making capacity, but the bombers being designed to fulfill this role were painfully slow, heavily armed defensive platforms that required vast quantities of aluminum, steel, and specialized labor. The twin-engine medium bombers then entering service, aircraft like the Bristol Blenheim, could barely exceed 280 miles per hour, making them vulnerable to the new generation of German fighters being tested over Spain. The Air Ministry's specifications for future bombers called for aircraft capable of carrying 3,000 pounds of bombs at 275 miles per hour, with defensive gun turrets manned by dedicated gunners to fight off intercepting fighters. It was an approach that seemed logical, even inevitable. But it was also an approach that consumed enormous resources and produced aircraft that were already obsolete before they rolled off the production line. Against this backdrop of conventional thinking, one man saw an entirely different path forward. Geoffrey de Havilland, founder of the de Havilland Aircraft Company, had spent 3 decades pushing the boundaries of aviation design. Unlike the large aircraft conglomerates that dominated British aerospace, de Havilland's company had earned its reputation through innovation and speed. In 1934, the de Havilland DH.88 Comet Racer had stunned the world by winning the Mac Robertson Air Race from England to Australia, demonstrating that speed and range could be combined in ways that challenged every assumption about aircraft performance. De Havilland had pioneered composite wood construction techniques with the DH.91 Albatross, perfecting methods for creating structures that were lighter and stronger than conventional metal frameworks. By 1938, as war clouds gathered over Europe, de Havilland began sketching a radical new bomber design. An aircraft so fast that it wouldn't need defensive armament, so light that it wouldn't require vast quantities of strategic metals, and so unconventional that it would be built by furniture makers rather than aircraft factories. The core insight was elegant in its simplicity. If you could make a bomber fast enough to outrun enemy fighters, you could eliminate the weight of guns, gunners, ammunition, and armor, which would make the aircraft even faster still. It was a virtuous cycle of performance that de Havilland believed could produce a bomber with a top speed approaching 400 miles per hour, faster than any fighter then in existence. On July 7, 1938, Geoffrey de Havilland wrote to Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman, the Air Council's member for research and development, with a carefully reasoned argument for his wooden bomber concept. De Havilland pointed out that in times of war, aluminum and steel would inevitably be in critically short supply, rationed and allocated to the highest priority projects. Wood, by contrast, would remain abundant. Britain's furniture industry possessed vast reserves of skilled craftsmen who could work with wood but who had no experience with metal aircraft construction. The strength-to-weight ratio of properly engineered laminated wood, de Havilland argued, was equal to or even superior to aluminum alloys, and wooden structures could be built without the rivets, stress concentrations, and corrosion problems that plagued metal airframes. Freeman's response was diplomatically dismissive. The proposal was too radical, too risky, too far removed from established practice. The Air Ministry had neither the time nor the resources to gamble on unproven concepts when war was imminent. Instead, de Havilland was encouraged to focus on more conventional work, perhaps building wings for other manufacturers' bombers as a subcontractor. It was the kind of polite bureaucratic rejection that had killed countless good ideas before, and it might have killed the Mosquito too, if not for de Havilland's refusal to accept defeat. Throughout 1938 and 1939, as Europe stumbled toward war, de Havilland continued developing his wooden bomber as a private venture, using company resources and personal reputation to keep the project alive. The Air Ministry remained skeptical, but de Havilland found a crucial ally in Wilfred Freeman, who despite his official rejection began quietly supporting the project behind the scenes. Freeman had already championed another unconventional aircraft, the Supermarine Spitfire, in the face of bureaucratic opposition, and he recognized in de Havilland's proposal the same kind of innovative thinking that might prove decisive in the coming war. When World War II erupted in September 1939, the sudden urgency of rearmament and Freeman's persistent advocacy finally broke through the Air Ministry's resistance. In March 1940, an official order was placed for a prototype and 50 production aircraft. It seemed like a victory, but the battle for the Mosquito's survival was far from over. In May 1940, as German panzers rolled through France and the British Army evacuated from Dunkirk, Lord Beaverbrook, the newly appointed Minister of Aircraft Production, cancelled the Mosquito order entirely. Beaverbrook demanded that all resources be concentrated on fighters and existing bomber types. The Mosquito, in his view, was an expensive distraction at a moment when Britain needed every Spitfire and Hurricane it could build. Only Freeman's determined intervention and de Havilland's personal lobbying salvaged the program. By July 1940, with Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany, the order for 50 Mosquitoes was reinstated, but the project had lost precious months and remained at the bottom of every priority list. The battle of development that followed tested every resource de Havilland possessed. The Mosquito's fuselage was constructed using a revolutionary technique. Thin sheets of birch plywood were layered over wooden formers, structural frames that defined the aircraft's shape, with each layer bonded using a casein-based adhesive. The inner skin used Ecuadorian balsa wood for lightweight strength, sandwiched between outer layers of Canadian birch. This created a monocoque structure, a shell that carried loads through its skin rather than through an internal framework, that was immensely strong, remarkably light, and completely smooth on the outside. The wings used spruce spars with plywood skins, creating structures that could flex under load without cracking, giving the Mosquito an inherent toughness that metal structures lacked. But working with wood on this scale presented challenges that no one had fully anticipated. The adhesives had to cure in temperature-controlled environments. Humidity could affect the bonding process. Quality control required craftsmen who understood wood's grain structure, its response to stress, its tendency to split or warp. De Havilland dispersed production to furniture factories across Britain. Piano makers, cabinet makers, anyone with the skills to work with fine wood, creating a supply chain that didn't compete with the aircraft industry's desperate hunger for metal and specialized labor. Yet this very dispersal meant coordinating production across dozens of sites, training workers in aircraft-grade standards, and solving problems that had never been encountered before. The Mosquito's engines presented their own complications. De Havilland had specified 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same superb 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plants that drove the Spitfire, Hurricane, and Lancaster. The Merlin was Britain's most precious strategic asset, a marvel of engineering that could produce over 1,000 horsepower from just 27 liters of displacement. But Merlin production was allocated according to rigid priorities set by the Air Ministry. Fighters came first. Heavy bombers came second. Everything else fought for scraps. Getting Merlins allocated to an unproven wooden bomber that many officials still dismissed as Freeman's Folly required constant political maneuvering. Even when engines were allocated, they were often older variants, Merlin 21s and 22s, single-stage supercharged engines that performed beautifully at medium altitudes but lost power rapidly above 20,000 feet. The 2-stage Merlin 61, with its intercooled supercharger system that could maintain power to above 30,000 feet, remained reserved for the newest Spitfire variants and wouldn't become available for the Mosquito until much later. This meant the Mosquito would have to prove itself using engines that couldn't exploit its full high-altitude potential. November 25, 1940. A cold Monday morning at Hatfield Aerodrome. The Mosquito prototype, painted bright yellow for visibility and marked with the civilian registration E0234, sat ready for its first flight. Geoffrey de Havilland's son, Geoffrey Raoul de Havilland Jr., the company's chief test pilot, climbed into the left seat, with engineer John Walker occupying the right. At 3:15 in the afternoon, with winter light fading and a crowd of anxious engineers watching, de Havilland Jr. opened the throttles and the prototype accelerated down the grass runway. It lifted cleanly, tucking its landing gear into the streamlined nacelles, and climbed into the gray English sky. For the next 30 minutes, young Geoffrey put the aircraft through gentle handling tests, feeling out its responses, checking control effectiveness, monitoring engine temperatures. When he landed and climbed out, his assessment was characteristically understated. The aircraft handled well, felt responsive, showed no unexpected behaviors. But privately, he knew he had just flown something extraordinary. The Mosquito was fast, visibly, tangibly fast in ways that required no instruments to confirm. The official trials that followed turned skepticism into astonishment. In January 1941, W-4050 was flown in direct comparison tests against a Spitfire Mk.2 at RAF Boscombe Down. The original estimates had been cautiously optimistic. With twice the power but also twice the weight and surface area of a Spitfire, the Mosquito might manage to be 20 miles per hour faster. The actual results demolished those conservative predictions. The Mosquito reached 392 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. A full 32 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire it was racing against. Here was a twin-engine bomber, carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load and built almost entirely of wood, that could outrun Britain's primary fighter at most altitudes. The implications hit with the force of revelation. An unarmed bomber that could simply run away from enemy fighters wasn't a fantasy. It was sitting on the tarmac at Boscombe Down, its yellow paint gleaming in the winter sun. Yet even this stunning performance couldn't fully overcome institutional resistance. The Air Ministry's initial handling report acknowledged that the aeroplane is pleasant to fly, aileron control light and effective, but questions remained about operational reliability, about wood's durability in combat conditions, about the wisdom of sending crews into hostile airspace without guns to defend themselves. Production authorization came grudgingly, in small batches, with most aircraft diverted to photo reconnaissance rather than bombing roles. The RAF's Bomber Command and the Air Ministry both strongly opposed using the Mosquito as a bomber, arguing that the concept remained unproven and that resources would be better spent on conventional heavy bombers like the Lancaster and Halifax. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe watched these developments with a mixture of disbelief and dismissal that would prove catastrophically mistaken. German intelligence had pieced together some information about a new British twin-engine aircraft built of wood, but the reports seemed almost too absurd to credit. Wood was obsolete, a material used in the Great War, not in modern combat. Every serious military aircraft was built from aluminum and steel. The idea that the British, who had access to more aluminum than Germany did, would deliberately choose to build combat aircraft from wood struck German aviation experts as evidence of desperation, not innovation. The Luftwaffe's doctrine emphasized heavily armed, well-protected bombers and powerful fighters to destroy them. Speed was valuable, but not at the expense of defensive capability. German fighter pilots had grown accustomed to engaging British bombers that lumbered along at 250 miles per hour, presenting stable targets for determined attacks. The notion that a bomber might simply run away, that speed alone might constitute a complete defense, contradicted everything the Luftwaffe had learned in Spain and Poland and France. So the intelligence reports about a wooden wonder aircraft were filed away and largely forgotten. The Luftwaffe had more immediate concerns: the Battle of Britain, preparations for the invasion of Russia, the grinding attrition of the Mediterranean theater. Whatever the British were building in their furniture factories couldn't possibly pose a serious threat. September 17, 1941. The Mosquito's first operational mission. Flight Lieutenant Alastair Taylor climbed into the cockpit of a photo reconnaissance Mosquito at RAF Benson, lifted off and flew south toward the English Channel. His target was La Pallice on the French Atlantic coast, deep in occupied territory, well within range of German fighters. Taylor flew the Mosquito at high altitude and high speed, slashed across the target area with cameras running, and turned for home. German radar operators tracked the intruder, and Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters scrambled to intercept. They climbed hard, pilots pushing their engines to combat power, straining to reach the altitude where the British aircraft was flying. By the time they arrived in position, the Mosquito was gone. Simply gone, vanished toward the horizon at a speed the German fighters couldn't match. Taylor landed back at Benson with perfect reconnaissance photographs and without having fired a shot or taken any damage. 2 days later, on September 19th, he flew another mission over southern France with the same result. German fighters detected, scrambled, and left behind as the wooden wonder streaked through their airspace untouched. It was the operational proof that de Havilland had promised. A bomber that couldn't be caught. The reversal of fortunes came with stunning speed. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, Mosquitoes ranged across occupied Europe with near impunity. They flew precision daylight raids against targets that heavy bombers couldn't touch, individual buildings in the heart of occupied cities, Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam and Copenhagen, railway junctions, submarine pens, V-weapon sites. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi Party's rise to power, Mosquitoes of the Pathfinder Force arrived over Berlin in broad daylight to bomb the city center, disrupting a major propaganda rally and demonstrating that no target in Germany was beyond reach. They struck at noon, when Reich Marshal Hermann Göring was scheduled to make a major speech. The bombs fell, the speech was delayed, and Göring erupted in a fury that became legendary. "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito," he raged to his staff. "I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and they give it a speed which they have now increased yet again. What do you make of that? They have the geniuses and we have the nincompoops." The quote spread through the Luftwaffe like wildfire, a bitter admission from the head of the German Air Force that Britain had achieved something Germany could not match. German pilots developed a term for their inability to deal with the Mosquito menace, Mosquito-Schreck, Mosquito terror. The aircraft appeared at all hours, at all altitudes, singly or in small groups, moving too fast for effective interception. Luftwaffe night fighters found themselves outrun by a bomber. Day fighters climbed to intercept only to watch their targets pull away. The standard Messerschmitt Bf 109G and Focke-Wulf FW 190A fighters that formed the backbone of German air defense could barely exceed 380 miles per hour at their best altitudes, and their performance degraded rapidly when burdened with extra fuel tanks for extended patrol times or when fitted with the heavy cannon armament needed to destroy bombers. The Mosquito cruised faster than these fighters could chase, and when pressed, could accelerate to speeds that left German interceptors hopelessly behind. German aviation engineers began desperate efforts to develop aircraft specifically designed to counter the Mosquito. The Heinkel He-219 night fighter, powered by twin Daimler-Benz engines and equipped with sophisticated radar, showed promise but entered service too late and in too few numbers to make a difference. Proposals were floated to develop a German wooden aircraft along similar lines, but by 1943, Germany lacked both the time and the industrial capacity to pursue such development. Back at Hatfield, W4050, the yellow-painted prototype that had proven the concept, continued its career as the Mosquito family's primary test aircraft. Through 1941 and 1942, it served as the platform for testing modifications, evaluating engine variants, and pushing performance boundaries. In late October 1941, the prototype returned to the factory to receive a pair of Merlin 61 engines, the first production Merlins equipped with two-stage, two-speed supercharging. This was a quantum leap in performance capability. The two-stage supercharger worked by compressing incoming air twice. A first-stage impeller would compress the air, then the compressed air would pass through an intercooler to reduce its temperature, then a second-stage impeller would compress it again. This allowed the engine to maintain sea-level air density, and thus sea-level power output, to altitudes above 30,000 feet, where single-stage engines gasped for oxygen and lost power dramatically. The Merlin 61 produced 1,565 horsepower at 12,250 feet, and could maintain 1,580 horsepower at 23,500 feet, giving the Mosquito sustained power across a much wider altitude band. On June 20, 1942, W-4050 flew for the first time with its new Merlin 61 engines. The performance improvement was breathtaking. The prototype reached 428 miles per hour at 28,500 feet with standard air intakes fitted with snow guards, protective screens that prevented ice ingestion but cost a few miles per hour in drag. With the snow guards removed and the intakes optimized for pure speed, W-4050 hit 437 miles per hour at 29,200 feet. This was territory that no operational aircraft had ever explored, speeds that approached the performance of dedicated racing aircraft, achieved by a twin-engine bomber carrying full fuel and equipment. But the engineers at de Havilland and Rolls-Royce knew they hadn't reached the limit yet. The Merlin 61 was optimized for medium-high altitude performance, with its two-stage supercharger calibrated to deliver maximum power between 20,000 and 30,000 feet. But there existed a more specialized variant. The Merlin 77, a high-altitude rated engine designed specifically for extreme altitude reconnaissance work, with its supercharger gearing adjusted to maintain power up to 35,000 feet and beyond. In October 1942, W-4050 underwent further modifications. The wingtips were extended, increasing the span from the standard 54 feet 2 inches to 59 feet 2 inches, improving high-altitude lift and reducing induced drag. The aircraft was being optimized for one final push, an attempt to discover the absolute maximum speed a Mosquito could achieve. Installing the Merlin 77 engines required careful work. These were precision instruments, engines built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, with supercharger impellers spinning at speeds where a tiny imbalance could tear the engine apart. The two-stage supercharger system alone added complexity. Intercooler radiators had to be precisely configured. Ducting had to route compressed air without leaks or restrictions. Control systems had to coordinate throttle position with supercharger gear selection. Throughout the late autumn of 1942 and into 1943, test flights continued, incrementally exploring the performance envelope. December 1943, W-4050, now fitted with its high-altitude Merlin 77 engines and extended wingtips, was ready for the ultimate test. The pilot, name lost to history in surviving records but certainly one of de Havilland's most experienced test pilots, lifted off from Hatfield and climbed steadily toward the stratosphere. At 29,000 feet, the air was thin and cold, the horizon curved visibly, the ground far below a patchwork of winter fields. The pilot leveled off, stabilized altitude and heading, and advanced the throttles to maximum continuous power. The Merlin 77s, their two-stage superchargers working perfectly at this extreme altitude, poured power into the propellers. The Mosquito accelerated, the airspeed indicator climbing past 400 miles per hour, past 420, past 430. At some point between 437 and 439 miles per hour, sources vary slightly on the exact figure, the aircraft reached its absolute maximum speed in level flight, 439 miles per hour at 29,000 feet. It was the fastest any Mosquito would ever fly in level flight, a speed record that would stand for the entire production run of nearly 8,000 aircraft built over the next 4 years. No operational Mosquito variant would match it. The PR.16 reconnaissance aircraft with Merlin 72-73s or 76-77 engines would achieve a maximum speed of 415 miles per hour. Superb performance, but 24 miles per hour slower than W-4050's record. The PR.34, with its massive fuel load and ultra-long range, would top out at 425 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Again excellent, but still short of the prototype's benchmark. The question that haunts historians and aviation enthusiasts is obvious. Why wasn't the Merlin 77 installed in operational Mosquitoes? Why wasn't this extraordinary performance replicated across the fleet? The answer lies in the brutal arithmetic of wartime production and allocation. The Merlin 77 was a highly specialized engine, optimized for extreme altitude performance at the expense of low and medium altitude output. Its supercharger gearing meant that below 25,000 feet, it actually produced less power than the Merlin 72 or 73 engines that offered better all-around performance across the operational altitude band where most missions were flown. Building Merlin 77s required the same skilled labor, the same precision machine tools, and the same scarce materials as building more versatile engine variants, but they were only superior in a narrow flight regime. The Air Ministry had to allocate Merlin production according to operational priorities, and those priorities consistently favored engines that offered good performance across a wide range of conditions rather than exceptional performance in limited circumstances. Moreover, by late 1943, when the Merlin 77 became available, Mosquito production had already ramped up using Merlin 72-73 and 76-77 engines. Standardization was critical logistically, operationally, and strategically. Training mechanics to work on multiple engine variants, stocking spare parts for different configurations, coordinating maintenance schedules across dozens of squadrons scattered across multiple theaters. All of this favored using a smaller range of engine types rather than proliferating specialized variants. There was another factor, rarely mentioned in official histories but acknowledged in private conversations. The sheer speed W-4050 achieved was almost too much. At 439 miles per hour in level flight, the Mosquito was approaching the edge of its structural envelope. Compressibility effects, the first intimations of the sound barrier, began to manifest at speeds above 400 miles per hour. Control surfaces became heavier, stability margins decreased, and the risk of structural failure from high-speed maneuvers increased significantly. The Mosquito's wooden structure, for all its strength and flexibility, was never designed for sustained flight at such extreme speeds. W-4050's record-breaking flight was conducted under carefully controlled conditions. Smooth air, gentle maneuvering, a test pilot intimately familiar with the aircraft's quirks, asking operational crews to routinely fly combat missions at such speeds, often at low altitude where air density magnified structural loads, while evading enemy fire and navigating by dead reckoning through weather and darkness, was simply asking too much. The operational Mosquito variants were optimized for a maximum speed of around 400 to 415 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun any German fighter, fast enough to give crews a meaningful survival advantage, but not so fast that they exceeded the aircraft's safe operating limits. Soon after the December 1943 speed trials, W-4050 was permanently grounded. It had served its purpose magnificently, proving the concept, testing modifications, exploring the outer limits of performance. But by early 1944, the prototype was showing the accumulated wear of 3 years of hard experimental flying. It was scheduled to be scrapped, cut up for analysis of its wooden structure's long-term durability. Instead, someone at de Havilland, accounts vary as to exactly who, recognized that this aircraft was too important to destroy. W-4050 was retained as an instructional airframe at Hatfield, where mechanics and engineers could study its construction, understand the techniques that had created it, and train on its systems. In September 1958, 13 years after the war's end, W-4050 was returned to Salisbury Hall, the same building where it had been secretly constructed in 1940. There it was restored to its original configuration, the yellow paint carefully reapplied, the interior rebuilt to match the prototype specification. Today, W-4050 remains one of the crown jewels of the de Havilland Aircraft Heritage Center, a physical connection to one of aviation's most remarkable stories. The expansion and multi-role impact of the Mosquito transformed RAF operations across every theater of the war. By July 1942, Group Captain Donald Bennett, an Australian navigator and pilot of legendary skill, was appointed to command the newly formed Pathfinder Force, a specialized unit within Bomber Command tasked with finding and marking targets for the main heavy bomber streams. Bennett immediately recognized the Mosquito's potential. Here was an aircraft that could reach any target in Germany, fly high enough to avoid most flak, and fast enough to evade night fighters, while carrying sophisticated navigation equipment and target marking pyrotechnics. Bennett pushed hard for Mosquito allocation against resistance from Bomber Command leadership who wanted the aircraft for other roles. Eventually, he got his Mosquitoes, and they transformed pathfinding operations. Equipped with advanced navigation aids like OBO, a radio triangulation system that could guide aircraft to targets with unprecedented accuracy, and H-2S ground mapping radar, Mosquito pathfinders would arrive over target areas ahead of the main bomber force, identify the precise aiming point, and drop colored marker flares that burned on the ground, creating visible indicators that the following heavy bombers could use to aim their bomb loads. The accuracy improvement was dramatic, turning bomber command from a blunt instrument that often missed cities entirely into a precision force capable of hitting specific factory complexes. The Mosquito's low loss rate stood in stark contrast to the carnage suffered by heavy bombers. Lancaster and Halifax bombers operating over Germany faced loss rates that frequently exceeded 4% per mission, meaning that bomber crews, who were required to complete 30 operational sorties for a tour of duty, faced statistical odds of survival that were grimly unfavorable. Mosquito loss rates, by contrast, ran between 0.6 and 1.5% across most of the war, roughly one-tenth the attrition suffered by heavy bombers. Don Bennett, in his post-war memoir Pathfinder, documented the correlation between penetration depth and survival rates. The loss rate was very low, down about 1 to 1.5%. The penetration was through to Berlin with those losses, whereas if you'd sent main force it would have been anything from, well, up to 10%. The light night striking force of Mosquitoes raided Berlin 170 times, 36 of them on consecutive nights, maintaining psychological pressure on the German capital while suffering losses that were sustainable over the long campaign. A Mosquito could carry a 4,000-pound blockbuster bomb, the same payload as many heavy bombers, to Berlin and return with a two-man crew, consuming a fraction of the fuel and requiring far less maintenance than a 7-man Lancaster. The psychological aftermath of the Mosquito's operations rippled through the German military and civilian leadership. Fritz Krauss, a Luftwaffe night fighter pilot who flew in the specialized I/NJGR-10 unit tasked specifically with hunting mosquitoes, recalled the frustration in his post-war account. Night after night, 30 to 40 Mosquitoes flew to Berlin and dropped bombs, and the psychological stress on the Berliners was considerable. Flak and searchlights were moved to Berlin without having any considerable or lasting effect. The Mosquitoes flew at altitudes above 30,000 feet, and after crossing the Elbe lost height to fly over Berlin at the highest possible speed to avoid the concentrated flak. The Luftwaffe experimented with using Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters fitted with special high-altitude equipment and long-range fuel tanks for wild-boar tactics against the Mosquito threat, but these improvisations never produced consistent results. The fundamental problem remained unsolvable. The Mosquito was simply faster than anything the Luftwaffe could field in sufficient numbers. For German civilians and military personnel alike, the Mosquito raids had an impact far beyond the physical damage they inflicted. The knowledge that British bombers could reach any target at any time with near certainty of success eroded morale and created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Unlike the massive night raids by heavy bombers, which could sometimes be detected early enough for effective civil defense responses, Mosquito raids came with little warning, struck precisely, and departed before effective reaction was possible. The disruption to German war production, while significant, was perhaps less important than the disruption to sleep, routine, and psychological equilibrium. Workers who never got a full night's rest produced less. Officials who spent their days dealing with bomb damage and their nights in shelters made poor decisions. The cumulative effect of hundreds of nuisance raids, each individually small but collectively overwhelming, wore down the Nazi war machine in ways that traditional strategic bombing theory had never anticipated. The enduring legacy of the Mosquito and its record-breaking prototype W-4050 extends far beyond World War II's immediate outcomes. The aircraft demonstrated conclusively that speed could substitute for armor and defensive armament, a principle that would influence jet bomber design in the early Cold War. The use of composite materials proved that non-traditional construction methods could produce combat aircraft of exceptional performance, a lesson that would resurface decades later with carbon fiber and advanced composites. The Mosquito's multi-role versatility, serving effectively as bomber, pathfinder, night fighter, photo-reconnaissance platform, anti-shipping strike aircraft, and ground attack aircraft, showed that adaptability and performance mattered more than specialized optimization. No aircraft before or since has successfully performed all 4 core air power missions, air superiority, strategic bombing, reconnaissance, and tactical ground attack, with such consistent excellence. Geoffrey de Havilland's vision of a wooden wonder aircraft that could outrun the enemy was vindicated so completely that the phrase itself became almost inadequate. The Mosquito didn't just outrun German fighters, it dominated the air war in ways that no single aircraft type had ever dominated before. It forced the Luftwaffe to divert resources, rethink tactics, and develop counters that never quite worked. It gave RAF Bomber Command the precision capability that made strategic bombing effective rather than merely destructive. It provided photo reconnaissance that guided Allied strategy across every theater. And it did all this while suffering the lowest loss rate of any bomber type in service, saving thousands of British and Commonwealth aircrew lives that would have been lost flying slower, more vulnerable aircraft. The Merlin 77-powered W4050 remains a symbol of what might have been. A tantalizing glimpse of performance that exceeded even the Mosquito's remarkable operational capabilities. That 439 miles per hour record, achieved in December 1943 at 29,000 feet over England, stands as both achievement and question mark. It proved that the Mosquito's design had reserves of performance that were never fully exploited. It showed that the combination of aerodynamic refinement and advanced engine technology could push a twin-engine wooden bomber to speeds that seemed impossible. Yet it also highlighted the compromises inherent in wartime production, the reality that building 8,000 very good aircraft was more valuable than building a smaller number of exceptional aircraft. The operational Mosquitoes that flew millions of miles over occupied Europe and Germany weren't quite as fast as W4050, but they were fast enough, and there were enough of them to make a decisive difference. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the test pilot who flew W4050's first flight in November 1940, did not live to see the aircraft's preservation and restoration. On September 27, 1946, he was killed while testing the de Havilland DH.108. An experimental swept-wing jet that was exploring high-speed flight characteristics related to breaking the sound barrier. The DH.108 broke up in flight over the Thames estuary, and Geoffrey's body was found on the mud flats at Whitstable. He had pushed the boundaries of aviation throughout his career, and he died doing what he loved, exploring the unknown edges of flight performance. His brother John de Havilland, also a test pilot for the company, had been killed 3 years earlier in 1943, when the Mosquito he was flying collided in mid-air during a test flight. The de Havilland family paid a terrible price for their contributions to aviation, but their legacy, embodied in aircraft like the Mosquito, endures. The Mosquito served in RAF squadrons until 1963, nearly 2 decades after the war's end, a testament to its fundamental soundness and adaptability. It equipped air forces across the British Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and served with several allied nations. Post-war, when metal and advanced manufacturing techniques were readily available, no one attempted to build more wooden combat aircraft. The Mosquito stood alone, a product of unique circumstances, unique vision, and unique execution that could never quite be replicated. Modern aviation museums preserve dozens of surviving Mosquitoes, each one a reminder of what innovation and determination can achieve even under the most adverse circumstances. But among all these survivors, W4050 holds a special place. It was the first, the prototype that proved the concept. It was the fastest, achieving a speed record that no other Mosquito ever matched. And it survives today, restored and displayed at Salisbury Hall, the very building where it was secretly constructed in 1940, allowing visitors to stand beside an aircraft that changed history. The story of how de Havilland's forbidden Merlin 77, forbidden not by official edict but by the harsh realities of wartime allocation and operational requirements, made the Mosquito hit 439 miles per hour unreachable, is ultimately a story about limits and possibilities. W4050's record-breaking flight showed what was possible when performance was pushed to its absolute maximum, when every compromise was optimized for pure speed, when the finest engines were mated to the most refined airframe. But that same flight showed why those conditions couldn't be replicated across an operational fleet. The Merlin 77 remained rare because other engine variants served better across the full range of combat conditions. The extended wingtips and optimized intakes that gave W4050 its record speed would have complicated production and reduced versatility in other roles. The operational Mosquitoes, flying their 415 miles per hour maximum speed, were fast enough to accomplish every mission assigned to them while maintaining the reliability, maintainability, and versatility that made them indispensable. The unreachable 439 miles per hour wasn't a failure. It was a confirmation that the Mosquito design had reserves of performance beyond what normal operations required. It was a margin of superiority so large that even after accepting the compromises necessary for mass production, the resulting aircraft still outperformed everything it faced. That, perhaps, is the deepest lesson of W4050's record. Excellence isn't about achieving the absolute maximum possible performance in laboratory conditions, but about achieving performance so far beyond your adversaries that even after practical compromises, you still dominate the battlefield completely and utterly.